We did not have money for marketing. And my job was to find money without spending any. And we took a company from doing under 700,000, most of that from one customer, and took us to over $2 million in annual in just 3 years.
Paul Green's MSP Marketing Podcast.
Extended interview.
Hi, I'm Brian Gillette. I'm the founder of the Feel-Good MSP.
The Feel-Good MSP. What a great promise is there, right there in that title. So, Brian, you were very heavily recommended to me by our joint friend, Kevin Clune of MSP Spark. He's a great guy, and he dropped me an email a few weeks ago and said, you've got to get Brian on the podcast to talk about MSP sales. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. Let's build up some credibility for you first then, Brian. So you're quite a young guy, but I know you've been in sales for some time, and you have actually done sales yourself for an MSP, haven't you? You've been there with your boots on the ground doing MSP sales.
I am a young guy. I have been in sales for over 10 years because I've been doing sales since I was allowed to work. And I was a VP of sales for an MSP for about 3 years. During that time, I came into an MSP who had a very, very full schedule and a very low checking balance. We did not have money for marketing. And my job was to find money without spending any. So that's exactly what we did. And we took a company from doing under 700,000 in revenue, most of that from one customer. I then dropped that customer and took us to over $2 million in annual in just 3 years.
I can imagine it was a bit of a what we in the UK would call a squeaky bum moment when you drop the whale client that's contributing a huge amount of revenue. But we'll come back to that either later on in this interview or in our extended interview on YouTube. So let's talk first of all about what you did back in the day for that MSP, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you now teach MSPs about sales. So I mean, it sounds like it's the dream hire for an MSP owner is to hire someone. And what was the phrase you said? It was not spend any money and contribute.
Yeah, find money without spending any. Yeah,
that's it. So I think every MSP owner on the planet would love to say to a young, enthusiastic salesperson, find money without spending money. What did you do back in the day?
I had an interesting situation, in some ways, kind of a lightning strike moment, where we had a tier 2 engineer who was just awesome. His last name was Brainerd, and he talked like his last name was Brainerd, and he looked like his last name was Brainerd. But he had some health problems at a very young age that made it very difficult for him to continue managing a network. He had a 60 or 70 user network he managed at a big nonprofit, and he couldn't do the job anymore. But here we have this IT guru who is looking for something he can do. So I said, hey, I'll take him. And I hired him as a sales guy. And I trained him on how to cold call. I trained him exactly what to do. I'd never worked in IT before, but we went through about 1 week of training. And then he started making 100 dials a day. And these are ice cold. I mean, essentially a phone book we were calling. We didn't have verticals that we specialized in. Essentially, if they had computers or a server, we wanted to support them. So he started pounding the phones 100 dials a day. He would book meetings. I would go on site because he was vision impaired and he couldn't go on site to these places. So I would take the consultations and then I would close the business.
So literally you'd got a guy who is just working the phones day in, day out, calling and calling and calling, having all the people slamming phones down on him, being rude to him, just not getting past the gatekeepers. And he was doing all that difficult, dirty work to set meetings for you. And then you went and did the heavy lifting work when you were sat there.
And I did a fair amount of prospecting as well. Mine was a little bit more targeted. The first thing I did was I was in a small town with a pretty tight-knit business community. And I thought, if a new business starts, they might want to join the chamber and they might ask the chamber for recommendations for vendors. So I gave the chamber a VoIP system and I said, hey, I'll give you a VoIP system for free. I'll give you the IP phones. You just have to tell everybody who gave it to you. Being new to VoIP, I didn't know anything about IT, but I learned, wow, people are still using POTS lines and paying more for an inferior product. How is everybody not selling this like crazy? So VoIP was really my first thing that I sold.
And were you using VoIP as the in to then have a conversation about managed services?
That was how I started. Eventually, I reversed it because I found that 80% of our MSP clients we could sell our VoIP product to, but the conversion rate was much less effective the other way around. So, of course, if you can get a managed service contract in, you can stick and spread, as we say in sales, and you can get in with the flagship product and then eventually sell them everything else.
So if we fast forward now to what you do, and obviously we'll give you a bit of a plug at the end of the interview, and I know you teach MSPs how to do sales. What's the kind of the structure now? Do you want to start at the beginning now? Because obviously that was you learning how to sell technical stuff, technology sales back in the day. What's the structure that you recommend MSPs use now?
Great question. For starters, the number one thing I hear from MSPs is they say, I just need more leads. I get into these rooms and I close 90% of them. I just need more leads. And that to me is a huge red flag when an owner says that, because the reason that they're usually closing 80 to 90% is not because they're God's gift to sales. It's because the only meetings they're getting are super warm referrals and they're getting one a year. So they think they can go buy pay-per-click ads or something at that quality of inbound traffic is going to be the same caliber, and that their sort of owner, IT engineer turned salesperson skills are going to be able to compete on that same level. And frankly, that I've just never seen that to be the case. So the strategy is you need a controllable, manageable, and forecastable lead generation process, not waiting for the phone to ring. That isn't a business strategy. You have to start there. But then, of course, the top funnel fallacy says, if I get more leads, I will get more sales. And wouldn't that be great if it were true? But it isn't necessarily true, because what happens when you get on site at the office? What are you going to do with them then? Just mass volume of opportunities doesn't usually turn into a more effective kind of or decreased cost per acquisition for customers. So you really have to attack, how am I getting leads, and be able to do so consistently and controllably. But then what am I doing once I get them? Have a process, have a very, very specific due diligence process, just as specific as you would be if you were dressing down a network for cyber vulnerabilities. You need to be that specific for how you approach sales opportunities.
I literally love everything that you've said so far on this interview. I agree with all of it, apart from the cold calling. But it sounds like you've moved some way away from that. That thing of I just need more leads. I can close the vast majority of leads when I get in front of them. I think every MSP I've ever spoken to has said that to me, and I completely agree with your assessment that just means that they're getting people ringing them who are ready to buy, and it's the real opportunity is actually to generate more leads, as you say, a controllable supply, and then actually to only have a close rate of 50-60%, which is a much more realistic close rate, and actually shows that you're really starting to max that out. Now, what do you recommend people do these days? Are you recommending having like a cold caller bashing the phones, or are you recommending something a bit more sophisticated?
It's a very interesting choice of words, because I would say this. I think that the best strategy for generating new opportunities for MSP is I want to be the MSP that's using the channel that all the other MSPs are not. I don't want to be another MSP in white noise. I don't want to be in the SEO race to zero, because to spend $10,000, $20,000 a year to be on page 4 of Google is not going to grow your business, nor should you be doing that. So I think that there's two real things. If I were an MSP today, this is what I would be doing. The first thing is I would be figuring out how to run webinars. Now, you did an episode on this, Paul, and you're the first person I've heard talk about this that how important it is, I think, for MSPs to be there, because MSPs aren't doing that. Webinars work. And if I'm an MSP today, I'm thinking about how can I improve the user experience of my customers, creating content that the receptionists, the office managers, the points of contact in my customers' environments are going to like me more because they watch this video. I'm going to run how to maximize your work from home experience using Windows 10. Nobody knows you can make duplicate desktops where you can have, what if you had a home desktop and a work desktop and you had the keyboard shortcuts? Or I would make auto hotkey scripts to teach people how to automate some simple things that they hate doing. And I would make those things available, how to use Excel like a wizard and make a 45-minute, things like that, about creating an improved IT experience where then people associate you with their technology. I would be starting there.
Thank you for your praise about the episode on webinars. That was episode 118, if you want to go back and listen to that one. Why would you recommend, Brian, that someone starts with webinars? I mean, surely videos would have the same effect of stamping authority and creating your expertise with technology. What's the advantage of doing that as a webinar?
you should make something that you can get 2 or 3 different variations of. You should make something that you can then upcycle to get more things out of. And what's to stop you from turning a webinar into a YouTube miniseries, into an audiobook, into audiograms, into text pull quotes for your Instagram? Something that's the flagship concept where you introduce the piece of value and then you can then get more value out of it later. Because if you have it, you can evergreen it or you can teach it live. I'm not a big fan of shotgunning content, or random acts of content. You may have heard it said before, where we just put things on the internet and hope that means people will buy things from us. So I think that is probably one of my main incentives for using webinars, and just getting people in front of you, knowing that you're going to eventually have qualified people watching your video rather than a YouTube series that you hope eventually somebody's going to look at later.
And then from once someone's watched your webinar and they're in your system, they're in your audience, you're aware of who they are, and you've hopefully got some kind of contact details. What would you do then? Would you just email them? Would you connect to them on LinkedIn? What I'm looking for, I guess, is Brian, what's your secret sauce from taking someone who has watched a webinar or connected to you on LinkedIn or is in some way in your sphere of interest, your sphere of knowledge? How do you then go through that process of then qualifying them and getting them on a video call or whatever you would consider the next appropriate step to be?
Exactly what I would do is get in contact with them, not asynchronously. An email is fine, but the whole point of an email is to get them on a call. Get them on a teleconference call or in person if you can. Get them to look at your face. The reason being that what my secret sauce is really the productization of my sales philosophy. I call the feel-good close. And it's the premise that people are motivated by experience. And that if you can bring human intelligence into the way that you sell and interact with your prospects, you will always separate and differentiate from your competitors. Most IT people actually put up systems to defend themselves from prospects, usually because they simply don't have the conversational skills, the confidence, whatever, to interact with them. So, I cold call into MSPs, and when they say, "Hey, if you'd like to speak about a new contract, press 2," and then it goes straight to a voicemail. So I would say get in contact with them and figure out how to bring honesty and empathy into this process. Don't demonstrate expertise. They don't actually care what you know about IT. They just want to check the box that says, "This is the IT guy." They don't care about your credentials. They don't care about your certifications. They don't care about any of that. They care about if you can solve their problem, and if you can just simply say, "I'm the IT guy. Now, thank you so much for calling. What's bothering you?"
Yeah, but they do also care about that there's a connection, that there's a trust there, and I think the words you used was it emotional intelligence, trying to bring some emotional intelligence into it, and that's what I think it is. And we've talked about this on the podcast a lot, that people buy from people. So yeah, there's timing things. People only buy when they're ready to buy, but essentially people buy from people. They're uneducated buyers. They don't know about technology. They don't know how to tell one MSP from another. So ultimately, it boils down to, do they like you? Do they think they can trust you? Is that your experience, that's what it comes down to that?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on, Paul. And in fact, I'm going to circle back. You said, what would I do if I were an MSP right now? There's 2 ways I would get leads. The webinar is what I would start doing because I think it would be cool. No one's doing it. And you can then always turn that content into more marketing collateral later. So if the webinar flops, you've got 45 minutes about you talking about something great. You can get an ebook out of it. You can get a social media campaign out of it. I cold call. I love cold calling MSP sales because most MSPs suck at talking to people. And in fact, most of the MSPs I take from other MSPs are not because of that MSP's technical competence, but because of the customer's experience, right? MSPs aren't losing customers because of their cyber security preparedness. They're losing customers because of the customer's perception of their value, which all comes down to their interactions. So if I can cold call someone and have an intelligent, emotionally connected conversation about IT, I am already driving a wedge between their current incumbent provider who's not fitting the bill and the services I can provide become very viable. So you used the term pounding the phone, getting rejection, not getting past gatekeepers. That is the traditional cold calling experience. But would you believe me if I said I have a philosophy about the way I cold call where I actually leave feeling more energized after 2 hours of cold calling than when I started.
That's incredible. Go on, can you share with us what do you do that allows you to walk away from what, let's be honest, what most people find a very draining experience? What do you do differently?
The honest answer is that I've done, 50,000 cold calls is a big piece of it, where some of the rejection and my history as an actor and a presenter and public speaker have made sort of fear of rejection no longer the daunting foe that it once was. I have this philosophy that people actually desperately need what I am selling. Most people are their own biggest problem. The reason that they've been frustrated with their IT guy for 12 months and now they're up to here is because they didn't have the skills to fire their IT guy when they should have 12 months ago. So they're not really mad at their IT guy, they're mad at them. And what they need is they need a shepherd to come along and actually guide them through the process of fixing their frustration. And so if I think of myself not as the hero of this story with my prospect being the foe, but I am the guide of the story and they are the hero, then I'm offering them an opportunity to transcend their current situation and get to a better situation, get to a better tomorrow. And that takes all this pressure off of me to be competent, to be the best, to be the cheapest. I don't need to be any of that, right? If I'm the guide, the humble Sherpa, and they are the main character, then this is all about them and their inability to see the value in that. It's got nothing to do with how good of a guide I am. It just means they're not ready to be a hero.
That makes perfect sense. Brian, I think you are one of the most quotable guests that we've ever had on this podcast. Just to pick up a couple of quotes, a couple of choice ones you've thrown out there already. Most MSPs put up systems to defend themselves from prospects. I love that. And another one, this is you personally talking. I love cold calling MSP sales because most MSPs suck at sales. That's just brilliant. Tell us a little bit more about what you do with MSPs and how do we get in touch with you?
So now I have a company where I train MSPs how to make growing their company and running their company a more feel-good and cathartic experience. Because ultimately your company is going to grow if you like growing your company. But if it's draining and challenging, you're never going to have consistent success in growing the company if you have to get out of yourself to do so. So that's why my brand is called the Feel-Good MSP. I run workshops and programs where I help create standardization of sales systems. I call it sales infrastructure consulting, where we go bottom up. We teach you how to double your closing rate, which would double your return on ad spend at the bottom of the funnel, not the top of the funnel. And then I eventually teach people how to get controllable prospecting through content creation and cold calling.
And what's your website address?
Yeah, feelgoodmsp.com always has the information for my upcoming event. This year I'm running one workshop a month, and that might increase later. There'll be more webinars and things. But I run a 3-day workshop every single month where you can learn more about what I'm doing.
Literally, I think we could talk for another 30 minutes or so, Brian. We're not going to. We'll do another 10 minutes or so. But let's dig into some of these things then. So you claimed there on our podcast interview, you've made 50,000 cold calls over the years. And I appreciate you don't have a little clicker. You've estimated based on the number of dials. But what kind of conversion rates should we expect? So when I used to have a marketing business before this business, so which I sold in 2016. And we had 3 telephone people and 2 field salespeople. And we sold like a £10,000 marketing package to veterinarians and dentists and opticians. And I forget what the numbers are now because I'm old and it's been a few years. But we got the numbers so perfectly after a couple of years of running this system that we knew it was something like we had to pick up the dial something like 700 times. And every 700 dials, £10,000 came in. But that, there might have been a 6-month delay between those two things, but we had it. We got it so perfect that when we didn't see those results, we knew something was wrong somewhere, and someone had either broken something, or a salesperson was lying somewhere, or something like that. So, in your experience with MSP sales, can it be as predictable as, yes, you make X hundred dials, and eventually you will get a new monthly recurring revenue down the line?
Yes. I think, though, the thing that you need to remember that is the sort of variable on your metrics is the quality of the leads that you are dialing. So if you're dialing ice cold and you haven't done really much filtering through those dials, maybe you don't have the cleanest database, then your dial number is going to vary based on that. If you're buying data from a really clean, really reparable sort of source, then your calls per opportunity, or CPO, is the metric that I would that I quantify that as. Your CPO is going to be a lower number, right? But we would see, varying on the sales rep, and once they had about 60 to 90 days to ramp, about a 250 to 400 calls per on-site consultation. So we had segregated where a cold caller and then sort of a qualifier or an on-site person would be different people. And so I would then segregate the performance based on what they could control, because my cold callers couldn't control the closing abilities or the presenting abilities of the next sales guy down the line. So I would measure their calls per opportunity. We also noticed, interestingly, that on cold leads that you don't have really any qualification for, the average call on which we booked an on-site consultation was dial number 6. Now, that I never expected that, and I would never have predicted that if I didn't have the data across tens of thousands of calls to prove it.
But that's just a random thing, presumably. It's not. Is that a case that it takes that number of calls to reach someone, or do you think it's just one of those things like flipping a coin, that it's random, but that's the pattern that came out?
I think that in our instance, that was a pretty predictable number because of the tier of customer we were trying to call. We had gatekeepers because we were trying to call in the 20 to 50 users, so you don't usually get the decision maker on the first dial. So it's usually like one call to get left in a voicemail, 2 call to a second voicemail for that person, a third call we'd call it the "Can you help me" touch, where we humanize the gatekeeper and ask them if we are dialing into the right person's voicemail. Usually we would pivot to the right person then, and then we're going to make 3 to 4 voicemails or attempts to get a hold of that point of contact. So that was the pattern we saw. And the reason I found it enlightening is that most people will only call a lead once, or maybe twice. They leave a voicemail and go, well, they didn't answer my voicemail. They're obviously not interested.
6 calls. And you're absolutely right. I think most people would call once. In fact, I would argue a lot of professional salespeople would call once, maybe twice, but they would very, very few would get through to 6 calls. That's absolutely fascinating. You talked about qualification. Most MSPs have a vague idea or sometimes a very good idea of what makes a good client for them. And it's sometimes about the number of users or the minimum spend or the niche they're in or the vertical or just the attitude of the client. What to you qualifies, what takes someone from being a lead to being a good lead?
Yeah, great question. The general idea here is that you need to have your own call card of questions you ask every single lead. And that can change vertical to vertical, right? If you're calling into dentists, then you were going to ask them, hey, do you run on Dentrix? Is that cloud or is that on-prem? Because one of those is great, one of those isn't. But of course, you're not going to ask that question to other verticals. But the key for me was, of course, I want to get a brief understanding of their environment, but I'm going to ask non-technical questions. I want to ask questions that aren't hard to answer. Because if I'm asking questions that require them to look vulnerable in front of an IT expert, they're just going to lie because they're going to protect themselves from feeling stupid. So I'm not going to ask them things like, really technical jargony things whenever I can help it. I'm going to make it a human question that says, now, hey, for example, I'll say, hey, how many people do you have in the office that use a computer more than 20 hours a week? Because that was my definition of a user. Hey, that's great. Any idea what kind of computers you're running? Don't worry about it. I'll figure it out when I get there. Now, do you happen to have a server? That would be a big computer that's maybe running in a closet. Okay. Curiosity, do you know what it does? That's what I'm going to ask. But what I find a lot of times in discovery calls from MSPs is they'll have a contact form that says things like, how many tickets per month does an average user submit? That's just a stupid question.
What's a user? What's a ticket? What are these things to ordinary people? These aren't everyday terms, are they? They don't really understand what that means.
Yeah, not only that, but it's a completely self-centric question. They don't give a crap how hard it's going to be for you to support them. And questions saying how much of a hassle are you going to be is the wrong way to qualify. We want to qualify in a way that gets us into the meeting, but don't try to sell a contract during qualification. Sell the next step in the process.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with this. Right. One final question for you on sales, and then we're going to move on just to some of your life experiences. All the good things, though, Brian. None of the bad things. What you and I speak to the same kind of MSPs. They're people who desperately want more clients, but they don't necessarily know how to go and get those clients. So for the non-professional salesperson who is essentially the business owner but desires more sales, give me two or three. I mean, you've already dumped a whole load of nuggets of value, but give me two or three things we haven't talked about, which makes a difference for those MSPs.
Yes. The first one I would say, don't sell by giving information, sell by asking questions. The classic trap, of course, being that we think we're supposed to demonstrate competence by talking about things we know, but nobody cares about you. They only care about you if you can fix their problem. And by demonstrating an interest in their problem by asking questions, you're building more rapport.
Yes, and actually, when you're asking questions, it actually gives you more headspace as well, doesn't it? More mental time to listen to their answers and to divert where you're going with the conversation. That's a great one.
Yeah.
Give us another one, Brian.
Yeah, I would say we build rapport by focusing on the solution, not through small talk. Nobody wants
Can
to
you give
talk
an
to you
example
about.
of that?
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for calling. This is Brian with Feel-Good MSP. Hey, how was your weekend? Yeah, it always goes by too fast, doesn't it? Hey, I noticed you're from Chicago on LinkedIn. Yeah, I've been there one time. You ever had a hot dog?
Yeah. So
Versus
you're saying don't do that.
never do that.
Okay.
It's the worst idea you can do because they don't want to be your friend. They want a conditional relationship that is transactional where they pay you money and you give them peace of mind. So you're going to focus on the solution. Hey, thanks so much for taking the call. Listen, I'm calling you for this reason. I'll give you a 30-second version. You're welcome to hang up after that. Is that fair? Great. Here's what I do for MSPs that usually solve one of these three whopping problems. I don't suppose you have any of those. And stay focused on the solution. And you end up building way more rapport by jumping right into the subject matter than by dancing around it.
I bet no one. In fact, this
Yep.
is you were saying earlier that you're energized after doing a couple of hours of cold calls, and I think with that kind of approach, I can see why. So I'm sure you do have the odd person that hangs up on you that is rude, but gut feel that's the exception rather than the rule. Because what you've just described there is not the cold calls that I get. The cold calls I get are, oh hi, is that Mr. Green? Yes, or is that Mr. Oh, no, do you know what's worse? What's worse? And I don't know if you get this in the US, but we do here in the UK. Auto dial. It's the number you don't recognize. You're like, oh, for God's sake. You connect the call, there's a delay, and then you hear the call center. And then it's like, oh, hi, is that Mr. or Miss? Is that Mr. Green? And immediately you just think, I don't want to, I'm not rude enough to just hang up. But yeah, I completely get that. Right? I think your approach is so much better. Essentially, you're asking permission for 30 seconds to talk about their problems. And then those people will go on to engage in that. I love that. Okay, let's ask a couple of more personal things. So, right at the beginning, about 30 minutes ago, at the very beginning of this interview, you told us that you started work. How old are you, Brian? Because now we can see you on YouTube. We can see just how young and beautiful you are.
Yeah, I'm 30.
30. Okay, so you're aging and moving on like the rest of us. That makes me feel a little bit better because I'm 47. So you started. I think you said it was about 10 years ago. So at the tender age of 20, you were hired by an MSP, and he said find money without spending money. And they had a whale of a client, and you said at the beginning of our interview it was 700K of annual recurring revenue, and you ended up dropping that client and you replaced it with other clients that were 2 million. Of annual recurring revenue. So what was without going into too much detail or giving away identities or anything like that, what was the problem with that client? Why did they have to go? And what did it actually feel like dumping the biggest client of the business?
That feeling was, to me, it felt so essential because when I came into my MSP, one of the first problems I saw was that we weren't collecting rich data about the actual health of our organization. We were looking around and getting a beat on what we saw happening. But of course, what we see happening is always sort of warped by our incessant optimism as an entrepreneur, right? We see what we see things becoming rather than what they truly are. And so we started collecting data and realized that customer was 40-50% of our revenue, 90+% of our ticket load. And so,
Got it.
of course, they were a noose. We had no time to do anything else. Our operations team was bending over backwards. And so I knew, because first of all, we had underbid that customer because they were so much larger than our typical customer that our cost per user was way less than it should have been. This was before I was on. And so we ended up not having the margin to actually support that customer the right way. So I knew with confidence I could replace that customer with probably 10%, 20% of its workload in 90 days. And that's what I did. We gave them a 90-day notice, and I started pounding the phones. And by the time they dropped, I had almost replaced the MRR completely, simply because I started charging considerably more per user than what we had them under contract.
Do you know what? If you could go back in time, get in a time machine and go back in time, take a video camera with you and just focus the video camera on the MSP owner's face when you say to him, hey, you know that client that's 70, 80% of revenue, we're going to give them 90 days notice before we've even replaced them. I would love to see the expression on his face from that.
Right. I think his forehead got a little bit bigger in that conversation.
Yeah. Did he got a funny shade of pink as well?
yeah, right. Of course, it was nauseating, but also, like most MSPs, have a toxic relationship with at least one or two customers. And I think the relief that he felt as soon as we sent the notice, where he realized, I'm not going to have to deal with this, and I'm not going to get cell phone calls at 5 a.m. to go install a security camera at a CEO's house, which is not in our scope.
Wow.
But because they have us so over a barrel, we have to do whatever they say.
Yeah, that kind of client relationship is never a healthy one. Finally, for us then, Brian, you said you were an actor and a presenter. So what kind of stuff have you done?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a competitive public speaker since high school, and I competed in a state level, and I was paid to present at VA events and Rotary events and stuff like that when I was sort of a younger guy. And I was a musician. So I was a jazz drummer for a long time, and it was either go to Berklee School of Music or move to Los Angeles to pursue acting. I chose acting. And there's a lot of things you would have almost seen me in. And unless you're up to date on the latest Persian music videos, you probably haven't seen me in anything. But
Persian music videos. Let's see. I think they're in my YouTube Watch Later playlist. I don't think I've quite got around to them yet. It must be insanely tough, because surely that's where every wannabe actor goes. I would guess Los Angeles. So in fact, I guess everyone in Los Angeles is either in Hollywood or they're waiting tables, waiting to get into Hollywood. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and they make salespeople, or actors make great salespeople, because they are so good at rejection. Because when you're rejected as an actor, it's not that, hey, thanks for calling, but we already have an IT company. It's that, hey, you're a great guy. Thanks for driving all the way to Santa Monica. You're not good looking enough.
Yeah.
Next.
Oh, so they're really brutal on their feedback. There's no holding back about it.
Yeah, I mean, they don't really gain anything by flattery normally, and so it could be pretty rough. It could be pretty rough.
Yeah, that sounds insane. And how long did you do the sort of the acting dream before you moved? So you were doing sales to pay the bills while you were trying to get acting gigs. And what point did you give that up and realize that actually acting wasn't really a thing for you?
Yeah, well, I quit the sort of acting chase after about 2.5 years, because I was flying around. I was working with a traveling sales company, and I'd fly out a Friday night and come back Sunday night, and I would sell all weekend at events, and then I would audition all week, and then I would wait tables or host in restaurants. At night. And it's a couple of years, but I've now later I've got more into voiceover acting, and the pandemic has made it so much more available for people to hire you from anywhere. So I accidentally started a voiceover production company because I just monetized a hobby where I just loved recording cool things with my voice. And so I do voice acting now, and I do a lot of corporate promotional videos and audiobooks and things like that.
That's cool.
So I still get to do it.
Do you do characters when you do voice acting?
I do, yeah. My first audiobook, I played 4 characters. None of them were American, and two of them were the love triangle characters with the main character. So I had scenes against myself all the time.
So can we listen to you on Audible then?
You can, yeah. I can't cite any of those books right at the moment, but I do more producing now. But I do most of my work in corporate training videos. So I work. I have videos for corporate compliance. So my voice is being heard by tens of thousands of customers for Fortune 50 companies talking about how to find a code of conduct and things like that.
That's so cool. That really is very, very cool. Brian, you have been absolutely fascinating. I'm definitely getting you on the podcast again next year in 2023. I think you and I could talk for hours about, and I think, there's nothing apart from the cold calling thing, and I've never been a fan of cold calling. Everything you said made perfect sense. And then you told me your script for cold calling, which is, as I'm sitting here now, I'm gonna sit post interview and sit and think, I wonder actually if there's something in that kind of approach. I absolutely love that. Tell us briefly again about Feel-Good Close and remind us how we can get back in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're an MSP and you want to grow your business, you want to go through a workshop, you want to network with other MSPs in small groups around the country, feelgoodmsp.com is the place to register for my next upcoming event.
Paul Green's MSP Marketing Podcast.
Extended interview.